And the Prime Minister will be holding a news conference in about 45 minutes. But before then, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by John Blaxland from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU, and in Sydney by Brendan O'Connor from the US Studies Centre. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Lentil.
John, if I can start with you, if the terrorism alert level is raised, this is a big step because it hasn't happened for 11 years.
Yes, but I think it's more about optics than substance. The bottom line is that the mechanisms in place aren't necessarily going to change. And if anything, the main thing will be about focusing attention on making sure that those people who are in security-related positions are on a heightened state of physical alertness. In terms of changing the way airports operate or in terms of the way procedures are carried out, I'm not anticipating a dramatic change.
Brendan, is this more about sending a signal because presumably intelligence agencies have been aware of an increasing threat for a while and have been dealing with that already?
Well, it's difficult for people like myself to second guess the professionals who work in that area. So in terms of what information they have, I don't know if I can say much, but I think on the political side, the sense that this conflict that Australia has kind of inserted itself into is being seen as much as a domestic issue as a sort of international issue. I might challenge that or be a little less uncomfortable, more uncomfortable with that idea that this conflict, which is really a long way from Australia, in some ways away from Australian national interests, is something we don't want to overplay our hand in. So obviously we want to support our ally, the United States, but I don't think we want to get ahead of the United States, which at times we've looked like we have been doing.
We'll discuss Iraq and Syria a bit more in a moment. Just on the alert level, John, there's been some talk that the number of steps in the alert level might be increased to put a bit more nuance into the system. Now, the UK has 5 alert levels. The United States only has 2. Would that actually mean anything to the public, to have something, say, between medium and high?
Look, I don't think the public has a terribly high level of awareness of this in the first place. Most people don't run into it except perhaps at airports and things like that. So it's about an alert for the people in the bureaucracy, in the security agencies and police forces and various security apparatus around the country, for them to be taking additional steps. In terms of the average person in the street, I don't think that's going to change very dramatically at all.
Brendan, there hasn't been a terrorist attack in Australia. We've had arrests and we've had prosecutions. Is it something the public should be reassured about, that we don't often hear very much about this, or should the security agencies be a bit more transparent about the threats that they are dealing with? Is it better to be reassured and hear nothing, or to hear a bit more and maybe be a bit more worried?
I think in the court case situations, that's when the public might want a little more transparency. So when there are trials, put the details on the table, then show maybe how plots have been foiled. There's been a bit of that in the past. I think that gives you a sense of the kinds of threats they might be dealing with when they come to being sort of, something that might be prosecuted. When there's not a sense of things being prosecuted, then I think people start to doubt the information and doubt whether these experts should just be trusted on sort of face value. So if you can show that you've foiled something in the United States, there's been a few cases like this, a JFK airport example, where I think in some ways that gives the intelligence organisations a kind of a credibility to make these claims about heightened alerts.
And John, do you have a view on that? Because the successes of the intelligence agencies are often the things we do not hear about.
Well, exactly. In the intelligence business, the secret of success is to keep your success secret. Because if you play your hand, you actually give the other guys a chance to counteract their strategy. And so that's not what people want. But I think it's very interesting that we've seen in the last couple of days some preemptive action taken against people who are purported to be linked with terrorism. And this is going to have a ripple effect across the community. And I think that was probably a deliberate step to try and act in a bit of a disruptive manner to try and break the cycle, if you like, and have a knock-on consequence, and actually maybe try and calm things down a little bit, get people back in their boxes a little bit.
We might move on now. Now, not only Iraq, but Syria will be the target of US airstrikes after the President Barack Obama outlined the mission to not only degrade but destroy the Islamic State extremists. He announced the broader mission yesterday morning, Australian time.
Tonight, with a new Iraqi government in place and following consultations with allies abroad and Congress at home, I can announce that America will lead a broad coalition to roll back this terrorist threat. Our objective is clear. We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL.
The President has pointed out that airstrikes will continue, and they have been effective as far as we understand. And we do have the capability to take part in airstrikes. If we're requested to do so, we will consider it in terms of the overall objectives. We will need to have a clear and proportionate role for Australia. We would need to understand the resources and the assets that would be required and have a defined timeline so that we can then weigh the risks, make our judgment and then inform the Australian people.
Brendan, did Barack Obama do enough to explain not only what the US would be doing, but why?
I think he had to make that speech. He was under a lot of pressure for not having a strategy. He'd said that himself. So he wanted to define the enemy on his terms, make it an enemy that he could at least see as being able to be, in his words, defeated. I think that's too ambitious, but an enemy that he painted in very negative terms. And so there's an unusual mix of a humanitarian mission involved in this, a state-saving mission for Iraq, and also a war on terror mission, which really takes us back to the Bush era. So I think it's fairly muddled what Obama's doing. It is a messy problem, but I think he's caught between basically sort of Clinton-like policies of the Clinton era and Bush sort of junior policies, and really hasn't been able to assert his own approach, which would be probably more prudent, probably more ally-based. He just hasn't been able to find grounds for that in his presidency or a way to work that.
John, we have a sense of what will happen in the short term. Do we have a sense of what's going to happen in the medium and long term?
Well, I'm not sure we do, actually. The problem is that what President Obama has declared as his strategy is more like an operational plan. We're actually missing a long-term strategy, and that's the real conundrum we face. We've heard talk about a coalition of 10 Middle Eastern countries supporting the US efforts in Iraq. But what are they doing in substance, and what are they really doing in terms of trying to get to the root cause of this problem? And this is, I think, like a multi-headed hydra. And what we're doing at the moment is we're trying to lop off a head. Well, what happens next? The problem is that none of us have a really clear idea of how to grapple with this. Part of that is because I don't think any of us really understand how to, in terms of the concepts that are motivating people to join this so-called Islamic State. How do you take the oxygen out of the fire? How do you really neutralise that? It's not easy.
And Brendan, as we've seen in the past, the US hasn't managed to destroy the Taliban and hasn't managed to destroy al-Qaeda. What are the risks that, if it does manage to substantially degrade Islamic State, that the next group that pops up will simply learn the lessons of what Islamic State has done, the way it's communicating, and get its strategy better?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, that's the right question to ask. That we've been here before in some regards. In the Iraq War in 2006, 2007, there was an enormous radical Sunni uprising under sort of al-Qaeda Iraq. America surged a massive number of troops, increased the troops, paid off a lot of local Sunnis to side with the Americans against al-Qaeda radicals, and they were able to put down those forces reasonably effectively and called it the great triumph of the Iraq War. And the Republicans often talk about it as one of the great military triumphs almost of the last 100 years. But really, these people are back again. I mean, the tactic is always to, in some ways, retreat when America is most interested in an issue, dealing with it most forcefully, as the Taliban have done, and then when Americans become less involved or distracted elsewhere, then seize your opportunities. So the sense that America is committed to this for many years ahead is hard to believe, and I think this has a very political element for it with Obama. His popularity isn't strong. He's taking a lot of criticism over this. I think there's a pressure to do something, and the fact that you do something, seemingly gets the sort of heat off you politically, but it doesn't mean it's the right thing.
And John, Australia's been sending out signals for a little while that it's prepared to be involved in airstrikes. Do you think doing something from Australia's perspective will involve cooperation at that level?
It's looking more and more likely that we'll be in that kind of ballpark. My concern is that that's actually, while it's going to make us feel good about kicking butt, if you like, and getting back at people for having done such dastardly things, it's not really addressing the core issues. It's going to create a breathing space, I think. That's fair enough. But then what? We need to think through the ramifications, not just in Iraq, but also in terms of Syria. And this is another aspect that people aren't thinking about very much is Assad has an ally in Putin, in Russia. And, you know, if we're going to go into Syria, then we need to think through the global ramifications, because this is something that the Russians are quite invested in. This is one of the reasons why Syria has been such a problem all along. They haven't been able to get UN agreement because there's been effectively a Russian blockage to that, and a Chinese one. And the Chinese aspect is also significant, because this is, you know, the so-called pivot to Asia is really kind of vaporising before our eyes, unfortunately, and we're not really, you know, in terms of what's in Australia's interests, us going and playing, you know, high school or primary school soccer in the Middle East and following the ball means that our concerns in Australia's neck of the woods, in Southeast Asia and in this region, is really being pretty much ignored. And if we look back at what happened in 2006, when we were ramping up in Afghanistan and in Iraq in 05 and 06, that was exactly when things were starting to fester in East Timor. And in May 2006, we had a crisis, and we were caught flat-footed. My concern is that this is really, you know, this is a part of the world where a lot of other people have a vested interest, the Europeans, the immediate neighbours. This is not something that we need to own. By all means, we need to be encouraging and being collaborative, but this is not our problem. This is something we can help with, but we've got our own neighbourhood to be concerned about.
Brendan, finally, do you think Tony Abbott has made the case for Australia's involvement, that this is in Australia's interests?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think with the problems in the Ukraine, if you throw them into the mix as well, this is a very complicated situation. I think the questions about Syria are a very good one. So I think there is a sense that we'd be better off focusing on our own region. If there's humanitarian assistance that we can provide in northern Iraq as part of a UN coalition or a part of a coalition, that might be a good thing to do. There are definitely people suffering there.